what was most significant in changing American sentiments about Black political power and Black economic power was not anything that happened through economics or politics. Instead, it was the widespread popular presentation of African Americans that led to the dominance of white supremacy throughout the entire 20th century. Following the Civil War, there was a change in the way that information was produced. There was a tremendous increase in not only the press and the newspapers, but in the production of paper goods generally. Song sheets were printed and advertising was invented. And those kinds of popular culture were spread through the second half of the 19th century, permeated with anti-Black images. You're probably all familiar with the idea of a minstrel show. A minstrel show is performed in blackface. It's white men putting on blackface and caricaturized Black features, and then singing funny songs about how fun it is to be enslaved. The idea of Jim Crow comes out of popular culture. Jim Crow was a comic dance character that came to typify all African Americans in this period at the end of the 19th century. The images were repeated and repeated and repeated. It was very hard to find an image in the press that was a positive presentation of African Americans as intelligent, as sensitive, as rational human beings. So everybody in America, North and South, was flooded with these images that were constantly denigrating and making fun of African American characteristics. At the same time, my own profession, historians, repeated over and over and over again the idea that Black Republican officials had been ineffective, that they had been unable to govern, when in fact it was the Democrats and the Ku Klux Klan that had actively worked against Reconstruction governments. That was rewritten as if it were the African American politicians themselves who had failed. This is everywhere. It's flooding American popular culture. To take just one example, I'm sure that many of you remember the uproar when the brand Aunt Jemima was retired. They said, we just can't have this any longer. People tried to put out a story that, no, it was this woman, Nancy, who had a great pancake recipe, and she was a Black entrepreneur, and it was fantastic. Look at these images. Jemima was a stereotyped image of an African American woman that was then created into a pancake brand. A woman was hired to be Aunt Jemima. It was not a woman who had a pancake recipe. And that's the history that was brought into the modernized image of Aunt Jemima. The fact that they took off a headscarf, they don't show the clothes that she's wearing, try to present her as a businesswoman, doesn't take away the racist background of the brand. And I think they made the right choice to just cut their losses and say, we're not going to build on this heritage any longer. It's time to let it go. By the later 1870s, even Thomas Nast, who had done very sensitive and uplifting images of African Americans, took on this idea that African American government figures had been ineffective in this later cartoon on the right. The effect of this, of being hit over the head with this racist imagery, was widespread acceptance of the ideology behind the imagery. This was not directly saying horrible things about African Americans. What it was doing was providing this image that all African Americans can't speak proper English, that they're not quite as intelligent as white people are, that slavery was a time of joy and love, that enslaved people were happier than free people who have to make decisions for themselves. All of these images reinforced these ideas, and that's what became what today we call implicit racism. It's an idea that people have accepted because of the culture that they grew up in, that they don't consciously even think about. It's just what they've been flooded with their entire lives. The effect of that was an acceptance everywhere when African American civil rights were limited, an acceptance that Reconstruction was a failure, a sense that probably those people in the South really couldn't exercise a vote responsibly, that sharecropping was very similar to that happy time of slavery, and so it was okay. All of the exploitation that we recognize today was justified by the white supremacist imagery that had flooded popular culture. So when African Americans were disenfranchised, held in debt, their children are taken from them, there's racist enforcement of laws that are targeted at African Americans, there's segregation, there's widespread rape, there's lynching, there's outright massacres. The huge majority of Northern whites will say, well, that's kind of sad, but I guess it's okay. I guess those Southern whites know what they're doing. It wasn't until the 1960s that Northern whites began to see a problem with what was happening in the South. Northern whites didn't start to see a problem until the late 1950s and the 1960s. African Americans always knew that there was a problem, and the struggle for African American civil rights continued from the day the Civil War ended until Martin Luther King's March on Washington, until the protests of 2020. There's a continuous line between Frederick Douglass and the Black Lives Matter movement today. What I find very interesting, though, is after Reconstruction, African American leaders adopted the Democrats' idea of African Americans. The derogatory image of African Americans was so pervasive that even leaders of the African American community looked at it and said, yep, most African Americans are problematic. But that was the old African American, the old enslaved African American. That's the comic image. And people like Booker T. Washington argued there's a new Negro, that's the phrase that they use. The new Negro is educated and can determine for himself what actions he ought to take and can be a lawyer, a doctor. But they talked about this new Negro as something that had to be created, something that people had to bring themselves up to, instead of simply saying African Americans are people and they ought to be treated that way. That's an indication of how deeply pervasive this white supremacist popular culture was, in that even African Americans themselves felt that they had to accept this derogatory image and then argue about how they could grow up from that, how they could improve from that, instead of calling out the image as false on its face. Nevertheless, there were significant leaders right through the late 19th and early 20th century. Frederick Douglass didn't end with the Civil War. He was active into the 1880s. Homer Plessy was active in trying to gain African American rights, particularly in New Orleans. Booker T. Washington was a herald of African American education. Ida B. Wells was a groundbreaking journalist. W.E.B. Du Bois was a historian from Harvard who wrote about Blacks in Reconstruction and rescued a lot of the history that would be ignored for most of the 20th century. Marcus Garvey fought for Black nationalism. All of these people were active and fighting for African American rights long before Martin Luther King Jr. came on the scene. Our perspective today is often civil rights begins with the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King, but in fact there is this direct line from Frederick Douglass through to Martin Luther King. And really, when you think about it, from 1619 onward, Africans and African Americans were fighting for freedom and equality in the United States, and obviously that's a struggle that still continues today.